evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Richard Cooper. I'm President and CEO of NY Spin, a not-for-profit corporation. Tonight we thank CIT for hosting this event. We'd also like to thank the following sponsors. Big Visible has been a sponsor for several years, and we greatly appreciate their support. Turn to Tech, a New York City school and free co-working space. Netcom Learning, Pearson Education, providing many of the books we raffle off at our events. O'Reilly Media also provides some of the books we raffle off. Okay. Back in 1996, I was providing process and quality assurance consulting services to JP Morgan. It was during this time that a new association came about in New York City, at the time called New York City Spin. I heard about it the night after the first event. So I made it a point to go to the second event and brought along tonight's speaker, who managed a different quality assurance group at JP Morgan. CitySpin, as it came to be known for a while, had not quite settled on who would lead the organization. It had established some rules for who could be on the steering committee, and among the requirements were the person had to be employed by a major corporation and be able to have the organization host some of the meetings. I got that right, didn't I?
You did.
Okay. And of course, they needed to have some interest and qualifications around process improvement. To make a long story short, our speaker fit that bill. And in short order, he was selected, or perhaps he volunteered. I never did actually ask you.
I can't remember either.
Our speaker became the chairman of New York City Spin. When he retired from that position and I took over, we created a new title for him, Chairman Emeritus. So now, without further ado, Tony Hutchings.
Thank you, Richard. That was dim and distant past. Well, it's good to have you here. And I should first of all thank Richard and Mark and the program committee for inviting me back. I think the last time I spoke to you all was 2006 or something like that. It was a while ago. Anyway, I was somewhat surprised when they asked me to come and give a talk, as I thought I'd given all this stuff up. As I sort of retired at the end of 2011 from Bank of America and took a year off, and much to my surprise, I'm back in the workforce, virtually full-time again. And to my even greater surprise, I'm actually enjoying it. But this time I came back as a consultant, or as my badge says, it's a contractor. First time ever in 40-odd years of being in business. And it's actually a lot of fun. I get to be rather more free than I would be as an employee. And I have to say that the task I was given by the CIO, who directly hired me, by the way, an old colleague from B of A, could not be more enjoyable in many ways. I was given free range to come and mangle all their processes and redesign anything I wanted to, basically. And I've been doing that. That's probably why it's so much fun. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. So now the challenge was to figure out what to talk about. So I thought Agile is a good topic, but I gather, because I actually lead the Agile deployment here in this organization, but I gather you've overdosed on Agile this season, or maybe in past seasons. So that was out. So then I thought, well, maybe we could talk about the software development life cycle and project management, portfolio management tools. So another mission I've been asked to lead. But I gather you've had too much of that as well. So that left one other topic, and that was testing, which is why that was one of the other missions I've been asked to engage on here at CIT. The CIO said a number of things when I first met him 18 months ago now. Some of the things that were broken included testing. She really felt they had no idea how to do integrated testing or acceptance testing. In fact, she didn't realize they didn't know how to do unit testing either, but I discovered that for myself later on. So what I thought I'd do is take you on a journey that I've engaged this organization on, hoping to get them to a better state than they were in when I first arrived. So the 4 missions I was given, by the way, when I came here, and this will give you a little bit more about my background, was to help get their projects coming on time. They had a strong track record of delivering very late. And I was asked to be involved in one of the key projects, which we did deliver on time, I've got to say. The other was the testing issue. Third one was that their SDLC was badly broken, they felt, so that needed re-engineering. and they really wanted to introduce a much more comprehensive portfolio management tool. So that was another mission. And there were a bunch of other processes that they felt weren't working, so would I help fix them? So it was a dream job for a consultant, really, to be given that kind of playing field to play in. So I had to pinch myself a few times to realize I'd been given that authority. As I tell my wife, I felt finally, after years in this business, I had a job at the big table. So I got to make strategic decisions with them. It was a lot. It's been a lot of fun. So I call it a little journey from a state of ad hocery, which is where they were when I found them, to hopefully getting towards Center of Excellence. They're not there yet. It's just a work in progress. And I may well call upon our friend and colleague Mark Fiedler when he comes back. Mark is a co-conspirator with me in this little journey. In fact, one of the slides is something that Mark developed himself, so he'll give you a bit more color on what's going on. So let's take a look at the agenda. So we'll talk about the discovery I found when I first came here in December of last year. Then, just so you can level set and get some common vocabulary, I'll introduce some of the basics, some levels of testing, some of the basic models that are familiar to a lot of people in testing. Then I'll start asking the question, so where would you start when you arrive in an environment that's got a badly broken testing environment or testing setup? Then I'm going to take you through several of the levels or phases of testing, from unit right through to acceptance and regression testing. Then we'll take a look at the all-important part of measurement and reporting. It's a critical component of good testing. Can't resist talking about Agile a little bit. So it's the testing in an Agile environment, which is very different from that in a waterfall environment. And then we'll take a look finally at how you might get to a testing center of excellence and some ideas about the progress you might make. Okay? By the way, stop me anytime if you've got any questions. We can get into a dialogue. We're a small enough group that we can have a chat. So this could get a bit boring, so let's start off with a couple of funnies. You've all seen this kind of picture before. You may not have seen one that's oriented towards testing. So if you take a look at the top right-hand corner, that's often how the testers are delivered, of course, the components they have to test in some jigsaw fashion. So have pity on the pain that they feel in that pain. And one more from our old friend Dilbert. I just really like this one. So don't be a baby. Go write some test software. Classic piece of Dilbert. So let's start with some basics now. Now, have any of you seen this before? It should look fairly familiar, at least in its structure. This is the testing maturity model integrated, based heavily on the CMMI, of course. Same 5 levels. Has anyone seen it before, by the way? No? I discovered this during my early days at CIT, doing some research. Turns out it's from a European organization, but so heavily modeled on the progress you'd make with the CMMI. So we start small, the basics, establish some good practices at a project level, and establish an organization for testing, and start getting into the measurement and improving stuff, and finally into the defect prevention technique, which is really where you want to be in the first place. Although testing's important, you'd really rather not make the bugs in the first place. So that's the journey, or the system. And this is where I found my client, of course, really just at the basic level. There were no standard practices. Every project was left to themselves. Their resourcing with testers was done very much on an ad hoc basis. Find them where you can. It did turn out we had one useful engagement with an Indian testing company called Mindtree. Anyone ever heard of them? They're one of the largest in the world, about 11,000 employees. They do a lot more than just testing. But it turned out they were actually a godsend because they have a lot of very good testers in the group. So I've been able to work with them over the last year, and we've actually had a couple of notable successes with them on key projects. But that's where they were, so we had a long journey ahead of us. A couple of sound bites for you if you're ever stuck in the elevator with someone you want to convince about testing. Remember, it really is an investigation into quality. And it's on behalf of the stakeholders, whether you're doing a product or a service that you're testing. So I often have to remind a lot of the project teams and the senior execs that I work with that not to get alarmed about finding defects during testing. It's actually what it's all about. But you'd be surprised how many of the execs suddenly get panicky when they see the defect rate going up. But the converse should be much more alarming to them. Having a serious set of tests that find no defects is a lot more alarming. It really means you know nothing about the quality of the product you're going to put into service. So it's an exploration. And remember, of course, you can have it good, fast, or cheap, but not all three of them. Choose any two of the above. So testing is all about quality. It's all about ensuring that the functions work as advertised. So it's some basics now about some of the terms I'll be using. This is just a sampling of the 20 to 30 different test types there are in this industry. But I split it into two major categories, functional and system. So in functional, you're talking about unit and integration and sometimes business scenario testing, if you're into business process modeling, data testing, security, and finally acceptance testing. So all those represent the functions of the system. And then from a pure system testing perspective, you might find performance testing and volume and stress testing. So they're the kind of things we've been emphasizing as we go through this journey with CIT.
Where do you
Yes.
regression testing? It's going to be part of.
Yeah, I'll come to it. It's really baked into all of that. You're absolutely right. It's part of functional testing.
Okay.
It's a good question. Has anyone seen the V model before? This is a very old established model. It's been around for probably 20 years. And it was developed really with a waterfall methodology in mind. But in truth, I think it works as well with any methodology. What it's trying to say is that for every stage in your development process, for every artifact that you produce, there ought to be a corresponding set of tests. So at the requirements level, you develop your acceptance tests. At the system design level, you want to think of some end-to-end system testing. Architectural level, you want about integration, how the various elements of the complete system work together. Obviously at the module design level, you're talking about unit testing. So the way it comes together. So you want to plan and design your tests top down, but of course you execute them bottom up. And then plan your coverage horizontally, as it were. So it's a simple approach to thinking about it, but it's not a bad one. I think this could apply in an agile environment. Just make sure that you've got as much coverage of the way you're developing your system as possible. Okay. So let's, now the journey I took these people on was started with education. When I realized there was so little information and knowledge about good testing practices in the organization, I thought, let me write a short paper on it. So I wrote this thing I called What's Up with Testing, just had some common terms in it, very simple introduction to testing, and we published it on the web, the company website. Communication and education is a critical part of all this. I've not really done with this by a long way yet. I really should have gone around and given talks on it as well, but it was a start. So trying to establish a common language, lingua franca amongst all these people, before we started introducing some of the tough things about actually doing better testing. So that was the first thing I did. The next thing was writing a strategy for them. I mentioned that part of my assignment here has been to work with actual projects, not just to sit in the background and theorize about how to do stuff better. So I was assigned to work on the biggest project they had going, which in fact went live at the end of August this year. I don't think you'll probably never hear about it if you're not dealing in the middle markets arena, but it's called FlexCell, and flexibility is the name of the tool. It's all about cost per copy pricing. It turns out for things like office equipment, there was no tool in the industry that allowed the vendors to price for the different services these various sophisticated copiers actually provided. It was one size fits all. So we've introduced this variability in the way that the vendors can bill their clients. Kind of important capability. So they were struggling over when on earth they could release this product. There was some commitment to some talk of it being last spring. So I got inserted into the project and said, well, let me look at your testing plan, which was really non-existent. So I said, well, how on earth can you commit to that date until we've had a good look at testing? So I was given leeway to work with them on a test plan. And I said, well, don't commit to your date until we've actually done the planning around how they're going to do this. And they backed off and held off until a few of us had worked on the plan. We came out with the date of August, and that's the one we met in the end. So thank God they held off. But the first step in this was to write down all my thoughts about how you would develop a strategy for testing. Before you do the plan or the schedule, what's your strategy going to be? So I wrote this with this project in mind, and then afterwards I generalized it for the entire company. So there is a document out there that any project could pick up and customize into its own test plan. What it talks about is what kind of tools you're going to use, what are the entrance and exit criteria from each phase in the testing, what are the various roles, how you're going to measure success, how you're going to report on success, who's going to sign off when you're done. So I try to cover all those topics. And again, I published that pretty widely. I also published, not that I've got a clip of this, no I don't. I also pulled together a glossary of terms. So there's a companion to that paper on what's up with testing, again to get the terminology right. And there's lots of good glossaries out there. It didn't take me long to pull it together. But again, I published that pretty widely, so people had, again, a common language. Yes, Bill?
From SIT to UAT, SIT means?
Oh, sorry, system integration testing.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes called just system testing or end-to-end testing. And UAT, of course, is user acceptance testing. SIT was a new term to this organization, by the way. They tended to go straight from playing around at the unit level straight into what I'd call exploratory acceptance testing. It's a scary concept of how to do testing. So one of the first things was to say, no, you've got to do end-to-end testing. These components are complex. They come together in a complex way. You have to test them together before you can afford to start functional testing at the end user level. So that's a thought. If ever you are involved in developing test approaches for your organization, don't be shy about writing down a strategic approach first. Very different from the plan, very different from the schedule. It's about the big picture of what are your intentions behind testing. Another thing I started doing, this might help any of you, in fact, as you think about processes, is I do the old swim lane diagrams of what does the testing process look like. So this is part of rolling out the new software development life cycle, was what would a new project have to do in order to get through its own testing? So there's the development team, there is any QA and testing team, an acceptance team, and there's the business, so with their various responsibilities. And the most useful thing about this kind of diagram, but if you ever do it, is think about the end conditions. How would you get out of each one of those phases? What does doneness look like? If you're familiar with Agile, of course, we always thought about defining a doneness criteria for the completion of something. That's something you want to think about with testing. How do you know when you're done with testing? And that was one of the questions I started asking earlier on. We had a couple of Death March projects going on where literally they'd been testing for years. I said, well, how do you know when you're ever done with this? And the answer was they never did, of course, because you'll keep finding more things to test, more things to repair. So you've got to have a plan, and you've got to have criteria for exiting. So that was for new projects. I did a similar one also for enhancement projects, keep the lights on projects, very similar approaches. You still got to test, even if you're not a brand new project. You probably start with something simpler like an enhancement request or a bug report, but you still got to go through those levels of testing and retesting.
A quick question.
Yes.
Did you capture any metrics to see where they had the most problems? Was it in UAT, system integration testing, or all of the above?
Could you
not
repeat
really.
that?
The question
We couldn't
is-
hear the
okay.
Yeah, sorry. Did I collect any metrics on where the the highest occurrence of problems was? Was it everywhere, or was it in one particular phase of the life cycle? The first indication I got was it was all happening at the user interface. But again, that was really only symptomatic. It really wasn't all there. I didn't actually collect a lot of metrics about that. And instinctively, and from previous work, I knew that we were going to find most of the problems occurred in the requirements phase. Any study in the industry will tell you that, so I really didn't need to repeat that. It's turned out to be largely true. Not controlling the requirements process is one of the biggest issues with delivering poor or late software. But no, to answer your question honestly, I did not collect those kind of metrics.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Since, of course, establishing a better approach to testing, and we do use test management software, we actually categorize all the defects that come in now as to what part of the life cycle they fall in, whether it was a requirements problem or a coding problem, whatever. So a couple of little diagrams. So let's take it now through each of these major phases. We'll start with the unit test. So each one of these slides looks like this, and I borrowed this freely from one of my colleagues at CIT. It's kind of well done. So think about what the purpose of it is, what are the entry criteria, what are the major activities, who performs it, and how do you get out of this thing. One of the first things, of course, to recognize about unit testing is they should be planned. How many of you think about planning the way you're going to test your code modules? That's a couple of you do. I've noticed a lot of people around here don't think about that. It's almost like it's an exploratory mission, as it were. And I have to admit that when in my development and architecture days, I used to hate testing. I loathed it. I'd do anything to avoid doing it. I was part of that arrogant breed that said, you know, I wrote it, it's bound to be right, isn't it? You know, why do we need to test it? Because it never did work that way. But I did manage to escape doing any formal testing until I got to JP Morgan, and somewhat surprisingly, I was asked to write a set of testing standards for the organization, which we did, but it was really just another project to me, and I managed to escape focusing on formal testing until I arrived here at CIT, so it was an interesting confessional for me, as it were. But even when you're coding, you should plan how you're going to test this piece of code that you develop before you turn it over to an integration team or some other group who are going to use it. And you need to have, of course, a decent development environment in which to do your testing. This is probably one of the biggest ahas, and Mark will acknowledge this, that we've been through in this last year, is to get them to think about separate compartmentalized environments for doing your different testing. You can't just dump it all into one place and hope you're going to get it right. So we've introduced a regime now of 3, maybe 4 separate environments: development, integration testing environment, user acceptance, and sometimes we might even have a pre-acceptance environment as well.
For large companies like CIT, you know, creating all these environments, there's probably, I imagine, adequate funding and, you know, people with
Not
knowledge.
really.
But
It's cheap.
For smaller companies, is it?
The boxes are cheap. The boxes are really cheap these days. And you can do a great deal of this by virtual machines. Well, you don't necessarily need different physical environments. You just need partitioned environments that are separately managed and carefully managed.
So
So it really isn't expensive.
So it's a very level playing field.
I think so. This is not a big organization, by the way. CIT is only 4,000 people, a large number of whom are contractors like me. So they're definitely only a middle-sized company, even smallish, compared to some of the companies you guys work in. Think of Bank of America, it's 300,000. JP Morgan's about the same probably these days. So it really isn't that expensive to set up these environments.
You mentioned that the unit test must be executed in the development environment.
Mhm.
It was a no-no when I was part of this. It has to be in the QA, which is mimicking development environment. Am I wrong on this? Or has
Which is?
the QA environment? You don't go to the develop. I thought you meant.
This is for the developers, right? This is for
I
doing their own
understand
unit
that.
testing.
My mistake, because
That's
I was
all right.
thinking in the go live. Yeah.
Now, as you get further downstream, we get to the integration environment, we'll talk about it in a minute, they should be mimicking the production environment,
Production, that's what I was talking
but not development.
Thank you.
It needs to be somewhat of a sandbox, somewhat. Clearly you want to make sure you're managing the state of the modules correctly. You want, obviously the latest version all the time, So your build needs to be managed carefully. But this definitely needs to be an area in which you can freely explore the possibilities of your module's functionality. Okay. So we are testing the system components as components at this stage. And of course, there's another term you'll come across. This is the only time really when you can indulge in white box testing, where you can get inside the modules, make sure all the data definitions are correct, that the sub-functions are working correctly. So you're literally taking the lid off the box and going inside. You may be using some additional tools like complexity analysis tools to find out where all your untestable code paths are. Not that that happens much these days with the kind of languages we're using, C++, C#. It tends to be much more difficult to develop untestable paths, but there are plenty of tools to help you figure out whether you've fully tested your functionality. So unit tests, the first and very important part of our little journey. This was interesting. Only last week I discovered this book, by the way, and I recommend it to you. It's not on the list that I gave to Richard, so I found it late. It's by a guy called Roy Ushrove. It's called The Art of Unit Testing. And I found it on ebooks, actually, funny enough. And it's really got some very good reviews. And I immediately passed it around to our Agile team, who are still struggling with learning how to do better unit tests. But here's some good quotes from one of the pages in the book. You may want to think about some of these. Think about automation right at the beginning, the lowest level of testing. Your unit test should be built into an automated test set when you're done. Now, some of the test manager tools out there, like TFS, which is one of the ones that we prefer to use in this organization, Microsoft's Team Foundation Service, part of Visual Studio. It enables you to build a separate branch of tests that will get combined with your main build. You can run those tests automatically every time you do a build. So every nightly build we do, these unit tests get rerun. If anything's failed, if anything's regressed, we'll spot it way before we go into production. So think about automation, make sure they're repeatable, make sure it's easy to implement the test. It should not be complex, otherwise it'll probably break. Try and make it relevant for tomorrow. So if you've got any kind of time-based stuff in the data you're using, make sure it's actually suitably forward-looking and not that it only work on one day a year. Anyone should be able to run it at the push of a button. So you want to remember when you're no longer in charge of that module, that set of components, somebody else will have to be running those tests, or at least be aware of them. Make sure it's fast, otherwise it'll become a bottleneck in your development sequencing. Make sure you get consistent results, so you get, when it's meant to work, it should get the same results every time. The test itself needs to have control of the thing it's testing automatically. Make sure it's independent of other tests. If they're codependent tests, they're going to break sooner or later. And when it does fail, as it's meant to, make sure that it gives you very easy detection points as to what went wrong. So some really interesting clues might be useful to you as a takeaway. Think how you think about developing your unit tests. And the thing I've learned in this last year, it's been my own discovery in many ways about better testing techniques, is this notion of automation. So the first level of your regression suite are the unit tests that tested your components. That's the very first level. So let's move on. We talked a bit about test automation. This is from Mike Cohn's book. I don't think it's the one that we've got that Richard is raffling, but Mike Cohn's a great thinker about Agile and other techniques. Really good author. So he developed this little pyramid, this automation pyramid. Start from the bottom up. Start with the unit tests, then start building automation into your acceptance tests or your API level, whichever way, wherever integration occurs, and end with the GUI tests. Capture and playback tools, which just about every test manager tool out there has. Quality Center, for instance, from HP, has QTP, that's its recording and playback tool. TFS has the same thing. Just about every one of them has it. It's very easy. It captures whatever you've typed into the GUI, the various fields. So you've got the answers baked in there, and then it'll actually allow you to play it back, and you can step through it or run it automatically. And that's the easiest part of the automation pyramid to work on. But the amount of time that will save you in terms of running manual tests and being involved in looking at the results versus letting this suite run fully automatically and self-check is massive. A good regression suite run automatically will take literally only minutes to run each time you start running it. The extent to which you don't have regression tests, of course, is dramatic. I mean, how do you guarantee that the system will continue to work in the future without a regression library? So this set of the tools can help you do that. So functional testing, this is the first time when the SIT environment shows up, the system integration test environment. So as you can see, it should mirror as closely as possible the production environment. It doesn't have to be an exact copy, but it should be very close. We strongly recommend that you use production data as much as possible when you're in the SIT environment. Most important, though, the components that are being integrated must be in their latest version. You've got to manage their latest versions very carefully. So at the very least, you know you've got the state-of-the-art version of your system that you're the integration testing. So that separate environment is really important. It needs to be kept pristine at all times. And then, so here's the end-to-end integration test. So if integration testing was about testing the components now that form together to make a system, end-to-end is now beginning to make sure that the full functions which might cross several integration units work together correctly. Same SIT environment, same independent environment. Here's where you might want to get your third-party QA team involved for the first time. We've discovered, I'm not sure it's necessarily a best practice in the industry, but there's huge value from having an independent team both develop and run the tests at this stage. So this is getting away from checking your own homework. I mentioned earlier Mindtree is the company we've been using a lot of. We routinely now seem to hire them to do our integration planning and integration testing, and they're really good at it. There's one caveat I would point out with if you do bring in an independent team, the first job you need to do with them is to make sure they understand the business for which the application they're going to test is in. It's hugely important. It's not just good enough to understand the functions of the system that they're testing. You need to understand it in the context of the business. Yes.
Could you give us an example where that didn't work well, or where it does? I mean, where it does work well. What it looks like.
I'm just trying to think. Maybe. Well, I can tell you where we had to learn on the fly, and that was the first project I work with, which is part of our vendor finance group. The SIT team that I brought in had really very little experience in the billing environments. It was a billing application, but the billing and invoicing application. And the system was pretty complex in itself. And it dramatically affected the way the Salesforce sales support team were actually going to be using their own procedures to make sales deal with applications. And I think if I'd known better, I would have started with a heavy induction into learning the business first. So we probably lost some time stumbling around with tests that really weren't as appropriate as they could have been. We tried to do a bit better with one of the applications that Mark is working on with me, which is a compliance application. We did give ourselves some training. I think with hindsight it wasn't good enough. Would you agree, Mark, that we should have been a bit more in depth? And so it repays itself hugely. Okay.
May I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Regarding test script and test plan, who writes that? Is it
The testing team, the QA team.
QA team.
Yeah.
Okay, I just
Yeah.
want to make sure. Okay, thank
Absolutely
you.
not the people that develop the code in the first
Perfect.
place.
Okay, thank you.
But they will work from specifications. If you're in a waterfall environment, of course, the golden documents here are your requirements document and your specification, your FSDs, whatever you want to call them. So certainly an independent team has to
Sure,
work from
absolutely.
hard documentation. It's impossible for them just to talk to people and get a sense of how to write the tests. So these people, and the user acceptance people even more so, live and die by the specification of the system. And again, same thing applies. It works perfectly well in an agile environment. There's plenty of documentation in an agile environment, contrary to what people might think, for testers to work from. So,
Right below where you have it circled in red, you have development and business analysts as needed for the performing role. Could you care to comment on the role of business analysts in terms of designing test cases?
Yeah, use them as advisors. Because they've often worked on developing the BID in the first place with the business. They're tremendous advisors into understanding things like data mapping, for instance, the intention of the functions. They're really useful people to have around. Okay. So user acceptance testing. So this is now from an end user's perspective, including administrative functions that might go with the system, like security roles, different roles, access permissions, and so on. Some important imperatives around user acceptance testing. First of all, the people that really should be both developing and running the test should be the users and their own business analysts themselves. Not the QA team, it's a separate team now, not the integration testers. At the very least, the users will have to sign off that these tests are an adequate testing of the functions of this system. You might find there are problems with them having either the background or the time to develop the tests, in which case you can use a third party, and we've done that inside CIT a couple of times, where would employ a different user acceptance QA team who write the tests. At the very least, however, the users have to understand what the tests are doing and have to sign off on the results.
It's just something I've done in entry criteria is to make sure that the testers have been trained in the software before you actually start testing, because you don't want to use the testing to be training for them. There's no way you hold to a schedule that way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So Matt was saying that make sure that your testers, especially the user testers, have been trained in the system before that you let loose on their actual schedule, because they may well waste a lot of time fumbling around learning what they're doing. And on the system that released in the end of August, we did in fact invest in a lot of time training these testers first in the tool, so it's a very good point. They're usually on a pretty hectic schedule. I mean, it's probably a pretty hefty load of tests they're going to have to run, so you, like anything else, it's got to run to schedule. Okay, so that's acceptance testing, and here's regression testing that this young lady asked about.
Yes.
Obviously not to forget, I've talked a lot about it already.
Sure, yes.
Let's go back up again. So at the end of the day, you want to finish up with a suite of tests, all the way from unit through integration through acceptance testing, that represent an insurance policy, if you like, that you can run continuously to make sure that all the functions you last published as working before you change any new code still work. It's an insurance policy that you're not actually screwing things up that once worked. It needs constant maintenance, of course. It's not automatic. There are quite a lot of times where if a certain function changes, you may have to go and redo some of the regression tests, but the investment is well worth it. Okay. So that's a very rapid tour through the major phases of testing, from unit right through to acceptance and regression. Let's take a look at measurement now, shall we? So this was the first progress report that we produced for that first application I mentioned, the one that went out in August. So it's the first generation chart, all about the numbers. It's all about the numbers and the facts. So focus on a few things here that we focused on every single day. Make sure you're keeping your eyes on the prize of how many days left in the schedule. One of the things we discovered earlier on was that you may not finish all the tests you intended to. That may not be a disaster. You may be able to reprioritize them, do some kind of risk analysis on the tests, make sure you run the heavy hitting tests first, maybe leave some of the other ones off if you're out of time. You won't know when to do that unless you're watching the clock. Next thing we always focused on, and Mark will speak to this in a minute perhaps, so what's happening with the defects? These tests are not just, it's not a question just running through them hoping they work. They will be generating defects. Some of them will need fixing, so you've got to revalidate them. When you put a fix in, you've got to retest them. So again, make sure that you're allowing both time for that and you're collecting good statistics on it. And I should say, by the way, this report was pulled straight out of QC, Quality Center, which still is the tool of choice at the moment. It won't be for that much longer, but it's the tool of choice inside CIT. Perfectly workable tool, keeps all the good statistics, tracks everything from requirements right through to defects, produces semi-decent reports, so good enough anyway. And then the other thing to make sure you're focusing on is, so what's your pass rate? Tells you something about the quality of the tests, and once that starts dropping, then you've got some concern about the number of defects you actually got outstanding. So this report we produce every single day, by the way, and still, yes, Bill?
What pass rate means something passed, it was tested
The
once?
test passed, whether the test passed or not.
Not after it was corrected, but just it went through the first time,
Correct.
the first time.
Correct. So it tells you a number of things. It'll tell you, in fact, how many are finding defects, how many are not.
Are there any industry standard metrics for a given quality of a development area, what the first pass percentage of success should be?
I guess there's so many variables, Matt. It depends on the experience of the team, for instance, and how good the code was that got turned over to the testing team in the first place. That was an uncertain in this particular first application. I had no idea how good the unit quality was because there were no unit test plans. So it's I would like to think you're at the 90% level out of your
First pass.
the first pass. One thing I've not mentioned in here, by the way, which again was another new term that was new to this organization, there's the notion of cycles of testing. You won't get through to the quality you want by just running the data through once. So in this particular one, I planned for 3 cycles, and we needed all 3, in fact. The first one, we're out of time, so you leave some tests that get deferred to the second cycle. The third cycle is all about picking up the mess left from the second one, so fixing and retesting the defects. So 2 is a minimum, 3 is probably a good number to think about. And there are ways of gauging and calculating how long the cycles take, by the way. If you figure out the average number of defects, how long it takes to fix the defect, how long an individual test takes to run, and how long it takes to analyze the results. You can come up with some formula that'll help you figure out how long the cycle should take. Sometimes you get constrained by the planners who tell you you've got this much rather than this much.
So if a defect is tested more than 2 times, that's a red flag?
That's a serious red flag, yeah. So,
okay.
yeah, and that means either that's much more complex than they thought it was. You may want to think about deferring the whole damn thing out of this schedule, by the way. Probably needs a complete rework. It's unlikely to be just incompetence at this levels you're all operating at. You've probably got pretty competent programmers, pretty good testers. So it's unlikely to be just a stupid mistake. It probably means things more complex than you thought it was. So look for dependencies on other pieces of data, other systems perhaps. Okay, so this was our first report, and here we go, Mark. You must recognize this one. So this is the one that Mark developed. And it's a lot more sophisticated, as you can see. There's a lot more data in it. Notice that we've got these really good burn down charts that Mark invented. There's 2 of them here, in fact. So cycle 1 burn down, there's UIT burn down. The blue line represents where we thought we would get to. That was the plan line. The red line is where we're actually getting to. So you're watching the divergence all the time. How'd you get back on track? Mark continually asks the team every single day, so what will it take to get us back on schedule again? It's a really important discipline to get into. All these things have got a finite duration, or should have. I mentioned a couple of times now that the idea of daily reporting is a good one when you're into the tough stuff of integration and acceptance testing, which is the back end of your waterfall cycle. When all the chips are down, you've got a committed delivery date, you better be watching these schedules really well. So we got into a daily reporting routine. Literally, it was pseudo stand-up kind of type minute meetings, no more than 30 minutes, sometimes less. Let's look at what the issues are. Is anything stopping you from testing the next day? Are you missing production data or data of some sort? Are you short of resources? What's blocking you, basically? Because you need to get back onto your schedule. So keep your eyes on that prize. Again, Mark always made us look at the new defects. So what happened between the day before and this one? Did you generate any more defects? How critical are they? There's someone working on them. Do you need to have that fixed before you can move on? You know, again, eyes on the prize. Anything you want to add, Mark, about this report?
Actually, the one thing I did want to say is we did log everything in the Quality Center, and the people that were logging into Quality Center had a resistance to putting in when they estimated to complete the fix and when they estimated to complete the testing cycle. And we had to push them on that to the point where they were no longer uncomfortable with estimating a date, even if they missed it, just so we had a line in the sand to figure out if we're on target or not.
Yeah, it's good thoughts, Mark. But we needed all of Mark's project management skills to keep us into this discipline and routine. It's very easy to get too comfortable in testing and say, you know, the report's fine. We don't need to meet tomorrow. We'll skip a week. Yeah, it's a lot of things can go wrong from one day to the next. So that cadence of literally meeting every single day, and it's been 5 friggin' months we've been doing this last project, right? It seems an awfully long time, but it's paid off handsomely. Yes, ma'am.
How big a project is this?
In terms of what, people or?
People, dollars, duration?
Dollars, a couple of million probably. People, not a huge team, probably end to end no more than 20 people in-house.
I'd say probably closer to double that.
40?
I mean, not just testers, but you talk about the ETL people, you talk about the Deloitte people.
Oh, I forgot about the army of Deloitte people. That's true. Yeah.
And are they located in the same place, or located in different?
No, we're never located in the same place.
Okay.
Even with a small company like CIT, and you'd think we could all be in one place. Livingston is the largest office place we've got, but we're all over the place. There's this office, we have people down in Jacksonville, we've got people in Canada, across in Europe.
This was not an agile project.
No.
No.
Thank you.
This was waterfall, and that report represents multiple releases, multiple streams per release,
Thank you.
and essentially using the same staff.
Yeah.
I didn't, by the way, this was deliberately chosen from, so it's October when this one came out. Mark has just delivered, in fact, the final one of these as these two little lines neatly converged, the red and the blue actually did come together in the end. And we were actually on, what, 1 day late?
We can call it that.
Which is pretty impressive over that long span of time, 5 months, to be 1 day late. Of course, there were some weekend workings and some night workings, as Mark will attest to.
Was there ever a point in the project when timelines were starting to really slip, and how did you
Not really. We never let it get that far away
turn
from
it
us,
around?
ever.
Oh, okay.
I mean, that's the trick of the daily reporting. You know, you don't want to wait for things to suddenly find you've lost a week. You know the way projects go late, right? 1 day at a time. You've heard that before, and that is absolutely true.
I was joking with Tony. Our burn down lines were beginning to look like evil swans. And what it basically meant was there was a head, long neck converging, and then a great big fat body at the end. And what that basically meant was we did not plan for weekend work, but we wound up catching up because of working weekends. So the weekends were the long neck things, and this last cycle we finished very late. We were only 0 to 1 day late on all the other cycles, but this last one, it was just too complicated. And the problem wasn't in testing, the problem was in the sequencing and elevation of the data of the multiple sources.
So we pulled 3 tricks all the time. There were 3 dials, if you like, we could play with to get on schedule or finish up on schedule. One I mentioned earlier was reprioritizing the tests. So let's keep a hard look at the ones we may not need to run because they look as though they've got low mileage or they're testing a low criticality piece of functionality. The second was bringing on more resources. Can some other people come in and help? Sometimes just hands and feet. And the third was time, using the dreaded evenings and weekends, which Mark managed pretty carefully. You don't want to keep using that all the time. You'll run out of time. There are only, generally speaking, 7 days in the week that I'm aware of. Once that becomes your routine, 7-day week working, now you're in trouble. And what do you do? So you use those only when you have to, but they're the kind of dials you want to play with all the time.
One of the things we learned is each cycle was not the same length. That was the mistake we made in the beginning. Cycle 1, you've got 100% of your tests to complete. Assuming we had a 19% failure rate. So literally, the second cycle didn't require as much time, and the third cycle required even less time. So once we did that, we found out we were getting closer to plan than trying to make every single cycle of the same length. That's assuming, of course, you've got a level number of people.
Good. So think about using this kind of report. This was partly automatic, a lot of manual stuff from Mark developed every day. Some good sections on here. You know, here's your red, amber, green reporting up here. Looking at your timeline. All the defect measurement stuff is here, and some place for putting contextual remarks. Sometimes you may want to share this with senior management as an evidence of how you're doing. Yes, Harvey.
So to take a step back, from a more cultural perspective, so you were doing all of this, and everyone was doing the various phases of testing, and you were able to measure. But from a cultural perspective, you mentioned you established common terms of strategy. But in order to then get to the point where you could actually implement the more disciplined approach and have people follow it, was there a period of time where you just set aside for that cultural shift before you did it, or you used this as to implement the cultural shift by teaching them as you went along?
This is learning by
why,
doing. Literally learning by doing.
Okay.
It's the only way I could figure out how to do it. If I'd kept talking at them, lecturing them, we would still been thinking about how to do it. So the best way was to introduce the practices on real live projects. And that was a godsend that the CIO gave me, was, you know, not just to think about better practices, but involve myself with key projects. And what better opportunity than to show it by example. So once we had decided that, there was just no pushback. I wouldn't allow any pushback. This is the way we're going to do it. It's the end of the story, right? And there was some interesting fights in the early days about, do you really need that amount of time? Do you really need that number of people? That many tests for this simple thing? How could it be possible, you know? You just got to stick to your guns and push it through. So it's paying off. I mean, this has taken way longer than some of the experts that we were working with thought. We never doubted it would take this long, by the way, quite frankly. And Mark and I, for sure. So stick to your guns and push it through, and keep all these disciplines. They're really helpful. You'll eventually get better at this stuff, by the way. This has been hard learning for a lot of us.
So how is it the experts got it wrong? What makes an
I'll
expert?
plead the fifth on that one. I think it's a case of them not understanding the full business environment that we were in fact. I'm not sure
Were the experts externals?
Externals, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They'd seen much simpler implementations of this, and when they began to realize halfway through this was actually more sophisticated and more complex a working environment than we're used to, where maybe one set of functionality was going to solve all the problems. We've been doing a lot of mixing and matching with this particular system we've been testing, and it was complex. Anyway, it was some dumb luck on our part to get the test.
Just a quick question before you change.
Yeah.
I think it's a very impressive slide. I have a quick question regarding the critical high defects row.
Yes.
The total defects you have is 57, and then you have new defects. I believe it was added, which makes it 59.
Sure.
So is this
So you're looking at
the row critical high defects?
So here we go. It's not showing up. Yeah, this row here.
Yeah, and then the last thing is fixed is 54. So you have some open ones still.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
that's,
Remember, one of your options also when you've got
which
defects
is okay,
left
but
is to becomes part of the feature set. Okay. I mean, truthfully, it does happen. Okay, we'll have a workaround, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. So
It's
live
nice.
with it.
Absolutely.
Learn to live with it. So you document it.
We had an SLA that basically said we would fix all criticals and highs. We wouldn't necessarily fix the mediums and lows unless we had time.
but for critical there's few I think still open. But at least you can see.
The
by the
criticals are all
numbers.
fixed.
They said 54 out of 50.
Don't forget, this is October.
Oh, okay.
They're all fixed now. Yeah.
Okay.
Remember back to
releasing
the strategy
tonight.
document I talked about? I put
So
some
this is
Very nice.
criteria that
Very
said
nice.
no system will go into production if it's got any critical show-stopping defects in it. Now, make that as a standard for the whole company, you'll do well. So we were watching that all the time, and in fact, if a critical defect came up overnight, somebody was put onto it immediately, and we had to figure out how to fix it. Yes.
And-
This is really impressive
Yeah,
as
very nice
a
with the
cultural
numbers.
change and an engineering change. And I'm wondering, in terms of the supporting systems that are necessary to make this happen. You know, for example,
Cultural systems, are you talking about?
cultural systems one, but also the version control system, the sort of the care and maintenance of quality center, and you know, the management of the different environments. You know, making sure that your SIT
Yeah.
environment is clean and kept clean.
Yeah.
Could you say a little bit about that?
They're all hugely important things. I mean, one of the first disciplines about managing the state of your builds is the most important. Don't ever regress by putting in wrong versions of modules, and that's a no-no. So you want to automate that. Build process must be automated. So you really want to never make mistakes by building the wrong version. That's a disaster. Similarly with production data, make sure that or any test data you've got that you're using, you're keeping very tight control over what data you're using at any one point in time, what the refresh rate is. The quality center Mark mentioned earlier, he was brutal on people about making sure that was kept up to date all the time. One of the worst things you can do is start looking at your progress with old data. That's very, very deceptive for you. You know, if someone's not entered the defects from last night, so what are you really looking at? You know, so Mark had to beat them up quite often, saying, "I really need you to put that stuff in. It's only 5 minutes work, but really make sure that we're all looking at the same set of data about where we're at." So lots of disciplines around that. Yeah, really important. And the environments, that's been harder. Keeping the environments accurate and up to date is a full-time job, I think.
One of the big mistakes we made in this job is not planning enough time for data refreshes, elevations of environments from one to the next. And in fact, that's what caused most of our delays in testing, because the environment and data wasn't ready when we were supposed to be starting.
Yeah. I think if I were to give you one big hint as the thing to focus on most of all when you're planning your tests is the test data.
Yeah.
That first project I mentioned, we ran into numerous problems where the team was entirely held up because we had to wait for 2 days for the next cycle of test data to come in from the production environment. We should have known that. We just didn't think about it was that important. But figure out there's a way around it. You can always put in manufactured data. Well, you can, but it's not doing the same thing. So plan that test data acquisition really significantly. It's very important.
So this project is live right now.
As we speak, actually.
What exactly does it do?
It's anti-terrorism software.
It's compliance.
So
It's compliance
systems.
software.
Compliance.
Yeah, it's
Wonderful.
compliance. So it's a big deal for the company, actually.
That's wonderful.
That's partly why they kept us on the hook for so long. Was this was a mission-critical piece of software. As was the other one. So the other one, the first one I mentioned, was business-critical. The business could not grow without this new, and it wanted to literally outperform its competitors, and we gave it to them. This one was going to cause the regulators to be all over us like a cheap suit, unfortunately. That's big time. So important to get it working correctly.
I just
You
have
don't?
a
Oh,
question.
sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, about testing. So it's not related to this, but about planning your testing.
Yes.
At what point do you need to have finished your test plan so that you make sure that you have enough time in the project to do all the testing?
Okay. Well, I think you should be planning your tests right in parallel with doing the design of the system, right up front. It's back to the V model thing. There is absolutely no reason why the acceptance people can't start planning the tests when they've got the BRD done. You don't have to wait for people to write code before you can plan these tests.
And the mindset is right. You're thinking about how these things should work, and you can
Right.
think about, it's a very clean segue into how you want to test it.
Exactly. Yeah, so very early on. And involve your QA people at that requirements level. They'll often have good things to tell you about how to actually design the way this stuff should be structured. Make it more testable. Richard. Right.
Actually, in some versions of Agile, there's a method called test first, where they actually write the test case, write the testing before they actually write the code.
You must be my straight man. Got a slide on that coming up. But yes, you're absolutely right.
What was that called again?
Test first, or TDD, test-driven design.
Oh,
Same
that's
thing.
the same as test-driven?
Test-driven design.
Yeah. All right. Another couple of hints before we move on to some of the other topics. Traceability is not everyone's favourite concept. Does anyone know why you'd actually bother with a traceability matrix, by the way?
To trace requirements, design to testing.
That's what it does, but why?
You get audited.
Why'd you
You
care?
have to get
So
all
you
of
can-
the requirements have to have a testing.
So it's coverage.
So you can make sure you're actually ending up with what you requested.
Okay. Yeah. And there's one other function, of course. It's a good piece of audit trail in case you get into dispute with your customers. You actually said this and I tested that, so hopefully it won't come to that. So in this particular case, I've depopulated all the facts, of course, but this one took from the BRD to the FRD, which is the functional requirements document, straight to the test case. This stuff gets managed inside a test manager tool, by the way. QC allows you to do this, as does TFS. This is about all of them. Provide that linkage. In fact, QC goes a step further and allows you to link from the defect, thank you, Richard, back to the test case, back to the requirement, and so on. So that lineage will certainly help you make sure you've got the right set of tests. Okay. What comes next? There we go. So test-driven design, an incredibly popular technique in the agile world. So it enables you to think about the testability of your story before you actually start designing and developing it. As you well know, with user stories in Agile, there's a thing called the acceptance criteria. That really is a great way of specifying what the test is going to be. If you know how to accept it, you really know how to test it. By the way, it also will tell you how to code it in the first place. That's why you have that test first or test-driven design concept so popular in Agile. It actually will help the developers think about making their units more testable. Another interesting piece of this little swim lane diagram is the notion that you get the product owner, waterfall terms, the product manager, if you like, to review the test before they're actually put into production. So he gets to say as to whether these are good enough tests. And of course, the product owner was there when you wrote the stories in the first place and helped you write the acceptance criteria in the very first instance. So it's logical that he would be involved, he or she would be involved in the test definitions themselves. So a big fan of that. A little bit more about TDD. This is what it looks like. It's kind of cute little diagram. That's really why I put it up. I didn't develop it. But it's kind of just how testing fits into an agile environment. And just a short story about if you've actually had to build testing into an agile team, you may find, as I did, that your conventional QA person, for a large part, doesn't understand agile. I had like a 10% success rate at interviewing people to work in the agile team who had a QA background. There was usually something in their resume that implied they'd read a book on agile or they'd been involved with the team. When we actually grilled them, they didn't understand it. They really wanted to sit in the same waterfall position that, as per normal. In other words, they wanted to be at the end of the pipeline. Give me when your code's all done and I'll test it. It doesn't work that way. You've actually got to be in the sprint cycle, developing your tests at the same time as the code's being written, and those tests have to run and complete before you can push that sprint into production. It's a very different mentality, and so 1 out of 10 people pass our tests. So,
just had a quick question on that issue of, like, I guess going back to a waterfall way of doing things. Mm-hmm. How do you level set how often you're going to be getting new builds? Because I've seen it happen where development says, hey, we got a new build, and maybe they'll give you 2 or 3 builds a day, but you're not quite ready. If you're doing iterative testing, maybe you haven't had sufficient time to go through your whole cycle, and they're already throwing new stuff in.
That sounds a bit rapid to me. I mean, the best practice is daily builds, I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure why, unless you're in some really fast-moving organization, why you need to go for multiple builds a day. Our Agile pilots, we've got 3 or 4 of them running now, doing daily builds. So at least it gives you time to do something before the next build lands on your desk, as you say. So watch that cadence. You could actually become too fast. I agree with you. Okay, we'll get next. Here's another piece of Agile thinking. I think this may have come from Cohn again. Think about continuous acceptance testing. You've heard about continuous integration. It's one of the hallmarks of Agile. Think about bringing these tests into an automated cycle all the time. So I mentioned right at the beginning that in our Agile teams here, we rerun the unit tests every time we run the build. So you're continuously making sure that your code is up to snuff. So building all these tests into an automated regression library. So it's a good practice. And the third of our reports, this is less attractive than the other ones. This is straight out of TFS, which is a very, very good testing environment, by the way. It simply shows you how many tests have passed, and in this particular case it all passed, but it will show you the fails as well. There are a lot more sophisticated reports possible out of TFS. This is just the crude one we're using at the moment. So again, your testing environment should produce the metrics for you automatically. And the last thing about the TCOE, so you've got some decent practices now. Think about turning this into a true center of repeatable expertise, repeatable practices, if you like. I borrowed this chart from Herb Krasner. It just shows you that you will actually get a drop in costs if you introduce a testing center of excellence. So think of these three lines where you're continually spending more money to fighting the standards you've got, whether it's external standards from the regulators or your own standards. You're trying to keep up with them by repairing faults. Eventually, your defect prevention techniques will kick in, and you'll save money on testing costs. He's estimating a 20% cost as you get to level 3. Thank you, Richard. You're nearly done. Actually, there's only 2 more slides. So there is a call to action. There is a case for introducing a TCOE. Next couple of slides are just an example from the consulting company that I'm working with. So this was their plan for getting up that ladder, that TMMI ladder. And this is the way they recommended introducing the Testing Center of Excellence services bit by bit, starting with functional testing and regression testing, bringing in automation pretty quickly, gradually working through security and infrastructure until you've got all those services that your testing center would offer to projects. Of course, projects would consume them at different rates. Now, this is a very ambitious plan. They think you can get to this state in 1 year. I think they're a little bit optimistic. I think it's probably more like 2 years. But if you start seriously, and we are going to start in the new year in this organization, establishing a testing center of excellence, I think within 2 years we could have it up and running. So that any project could call on the testing services it needs, depending on where they and their business are in their own maturity. And this is the final state you might get to with your testing center of excellence. So on the left and right wings, you'll have your PMO, managing the test methodologies and your metrics, demand management. At the bottom is your infrastructural pieces, like your repositories for test cases, your test frameworks, your test tools. And then right in the middle are the series of services that each individual business or project would call upon, whether they're doing middleware testing, whether it's SOA testing, service-oriented architectures, or test data management. So they'd call on those as they needed, as their own maturity advanced. In a 3-phase plan. So that's kind of a couple of thoughts for you to how you might get your own testing center of excellence set up. Some references. I've mentioned The Art of Unit Testing by Roy. There's a linkage to the TMMI organization if you want to get to it. A couple of other books that I've forgot to mention to Richard earlier. There's Mike Cohn's User Stories Applied for Agile Software Development. That may be the one you've got, I'm not sure. It's the same title, it's very similar. Jerry Weinberg, of course, one of the legends of the software development industry. Perfect Software and Other Illusions about Testing. And Glenn Myers, another one of these luminaries, The Art of Software Testing. So they're good reference books, in addition to the ones that Richard's rattling off for you. And finally, just to complete, that is the full set of terms that you'll hear in the testing industry, if you like. We've only talked about a few of those today. There's a lot more in there, like smoke testing and stress testing, and walkthroughs and so on. Anyways, just reference for you. Okay, and any more questions?
What's black box testing?
Well, that's testing from the outside without looking inside the functionality. So you're not looking at data definitions or the way the methods are written. So you're basically testing it from its published interface.
Okay. I was just curious how many defects you actually found, if any, once you went live.
You always find defects when you go live. Seriously, I mean, in this The first application that I talked about, we probably found 20 or so defects in 65. This later one's almost too soon to tell you, but the earlier versions that we put through their testing in the summer, actually I think they've found one or no defects in particular functions, so we did test it pretty thoroughly.
Is that more a function of not having the right test plans, or where do you think that?
What, the number of defects you'll find? Depending on usage. I mean, if the user population sticks pretty much to what they told you to build, in other words, to their own specification, you shouldn't find much usage anymore, many usage defects. You'll inevitably find things that just break under stress. Usually you'll find that as their own business model matures, they'll be using the product in different ways, so you will uncover latent defects that you just simply didn't test for.
Okay.
So that's a usage-based thing. Yes.
Somewhere in that timeline, would you still do a code review, and if so, when?
I would certainly do code reviews right up front before I've actually done any testing.
Even before unit testing?
Yeah. We didn't spend much time talking about peer reviews, code reviews. They're still really valuable techniques. Agile's embraced it under the peer programming concept. So 2 people, buddy programming. What you're really doing there is you're doing dynamic, continuous peer reviews is what you're doing, code reviews, by having someone looking over your shoulders and giving you good clues. Great techniques. We did use that a little bit on this last program that Mark was involved with. We were discovering there were a bunch of data mapping issues that were coming up, which were failing in real time. So why don't we actually step back and review that stuff offline, see if we've got any others that we've not bumped into yet. And that actually paid off. So we stepped back and did some reviews right in the middle of testing. We should have done it at the beginning, in fact, but hindsight's wonderful. Yes.
I was wondering if these are systems that are used internally or by the company's customers externally?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, this last one, it will be only used internally, but the first one's absolutely used by clients as well as by internal salespeople.
So as a follow-up, I was wondering if there's any testing that's devoted to the sort of holistic user experience, where one software tool would be used in conjunction with many others in a workspace or on a desktop, and seeing sort of interplay between the two, or the cognitive load on the users.
Keep talking. I'll pick up on what you're saying. So holistically, let me just think about that for a minute.
So in terms of, in an in-house environment, where you have multiple systems, at least in some of the work I've been associated with, in the past couple of years, there's a concept of software being designed to be as stress-free. In other words, rather than each system being designed on the assumption that you're paying 100% attention to that system while you're working. When you have multiple systems, you have a heavy cognitive load on the users. So some of the test techniques I've seen evolving in the user experience world try to model that and see, about error rates, that might be something that the users would be prone to. I'm just curious whether that's been...
We're a million miles from that. I mean, that almost requires your business to have a sense of what its user base is doing with itself, right? I mean, and we do tend to think in silos in many terms, so you design systems like that as well. And that's the opposite of what you're trying to get to. I think you need to be a pretty mature organization to try and represent that true work experience. I mean, think about whether Microsoft does that for you at your Windows environment. Do you think they really think about that?
No, I don't think Microsoft does that at all, but in some of the,
So do you know anyone's doing that?
Oh yeah, I mean, some of the investment banks, SAP does it for their internal users, so.
SAP, but it's only a segment of the workspace.
No, I mean internally.
I'm trying to think of an investment bank that would possibly do that. I can't think of one.
We'll talk later, but it's. But I think when I'm talking about SAP within their own organization, they study how their users spend their days at their in front of their workstations, and understanding the cognitive
so they must have got some ethnographers working around the place, then, have they?
They
I
just,
thought so.
yeah.
Wow, it's an interesting experience. You should come and talk about it. It's,
Well, I'm just curious, you had so many interesting different types of testing listed on your Center of Excellence. I just was curious whether there was a call for any of that.
yeah, what's the opposite look like for designing the systems that you would test using those features? Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it. You piqued my interest. Thank you. Any more? I know Richard's anxious to wrap this up. So.
What about dedicated testers as opposed to testers or test teams that are dedicated to the project as opposed to testers who are working on multiple projects? Do you have any data on showing?
Well, in these particular cases, we had fully dedicated testers. That's all they were doing, was testing this particular application. And I think it was necessary given the state this organization's in with, understanding how to test. If you can afford it, it's still the right way to do it. You've heard the agile theory about context switching, You can't deal with context switching that well, and if you're testing multiple things, you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes as well. So I would advocate dedicated, as long as you can afford it. Anything else? Well, thank you. You've been a really interactive audience.